Well, welcome everybody. Happy New Year. Thanks for joining us today. We are very excited to have you all here today. My name is Robin Al-Haddad, and I am the Community Manager for QualME, which is Ideal's Qualitative Monitoring and Evaluation peer community. This is our first event for 2024, so I'm happy to welcome you all as this learning session will focus on qualitative data recording, data management, and analysis. So the purpose of today's session is really just to familiarize yourself with the steps needed to carefully record and manage and analyze data collected as part of a qualitative study, and get some hands-on practice sort of identifying themes and patterns and relationships in data. Very soon, Ideal will be publishing a new M&E qualitative e-course that's going to come out very soon, where you can get more in-depth learning on qualitative data recording, data management, and data analysis. Later at the end of this session, I will give a little bit more details on the upcoming e-courses that we have coming out. This is a peer community. We would like to get to know each other a little bit better. So go ahead, as I mentioned, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat as you come into the room. Please share your name, your organization, your position of where you're based, and please put your responses into the chat. I also want to remind folks of some best practices as we are here today. If you all could mute your microphone when you're not speaking, that way we're not hearing your background noise and things like that. You can use the chat box, you can use the raise your hand button if you have a question, and we will try to call on you. We will do our best to try to answer as many questions as we can in the short amount of time that we have. If your bandwidth allows and you are going to ask a question or come on the screen, if you could please turn on your video so that we can all get to know each other and see each other better. And lastly, we are recording this session today, and we will send out the link to the recording after the event, so you will get the recording. The QualME events are generally held once per quarter. And each meeting has a different discussion, a different topic that we're talking about. So as I mentioned today, we're talking about data recording, data management, and analysis. And this meeting is really just intended to give you a very brief overview of sort of the best practices for recording, managing your qualitative data. So for our agenda today, first, we're going to hear from a colleague from Tango International who will give us just a very brief overview and introduction to the topic of today on qualitative data recording, data management, and analysis. And then after we have our plenary session, we will then break up into small groups for individual discussions, and we will do a coding exercise while we're in those rooms. We are a community here, and so we want to encourage you all to, create a safe space in those breakout rooms. We want to hear from everyone. It doesn't matter if you're new to the field or you're a leading expert in the field. We encourage everyone to try to share their experiences in that breakout room and try to, get a chance to make new connections and meet new colleagues while you're in those breakout rooms. All right. So we will now turn it over to Elizabeth Cuellar, who's going to give us an overview of a very brief introduction onto today's topic. So Elizabeth, or she often goes by Ellie, so I will call her Ellie, is a senior M&E specialist at Tango International who has experience in designing and implementing qualitative studies across multiple contexts. Most recently, she has worked with data sets in English, Spanish, and French, and from Madagascar, Honduras, Kenya, and Uganda. And her current work focuses on managing and analyzing qualitative data for programs focused on food security, livelihoods, natural resource management, and resilience capacities. She is particularly interested in exploring psychosocial dynamics of well-being. As Ellie is presenting, feel free to write your questions in the chat or use the raise your hand button, and we will try to get to your questions at the end. She'll have an opportunity to answer questions immediately after her presentation. So now I'm going to hand it over to you, Ellie.
Hi, thanks so much, Robin. Can you hear me okay first of all?
I can, yes.
Great, thank you. Um, Thanks for having me on this really exciting event. As Robin just mentioned, this is a very brief overview of some good practices on data recording, management, and analysis for qualitative data. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thanks, Val. The information that we're going to present on today comes from the Qualitative Design Toolkit, which I believe is available online. We can share the link after this presentation. It's available through the FSN Network website. As part of this toolkit, we have a workbook as well as a qualitative inquiry planning sheet, which we will refer to as a QUIPS. A QUIPS is a type of qualitative protocol that helps you and your team design the type of either monitoring study or inquiry that you will develop as part of your either emergency or non-emergency activity. The idea is really to help you frame the purpose, the objectives, the research questions, and from that information, you will develop the different phases of your study in a very structured way. So it's really a tool. These are all tools to help you and your team create very rigorous qualitative inquiry that will improve the ongoing activities that you all are involved in. So why do we want to think about qualitative data? Qualitative data helps us bring richness to the information that we already collect, perhaps in a more quantitative method. We are capturing rich and meaningful perspectives from the communities in which we're working, from the participants, also from stakeholders. So for instance, we might want to think about how climate change is impacting the activities and people's responses, how different environmental protection is taking shape in different contexts. Perhaps we want to think about how our activity is progressing over time, any underlying factors that may be influencing people's behaviors, attitudes, so things that may answer the why or the how, whereas we may already understand the what, which we are gathering in more quantitative methods. Next slide, please. So for this presentation, again, we'll just look at a very small section of the QUIPS. Next slide, please. But before we dive into the section that you see on data recording, data management, and data analysis, we want to think first about the purpose of why we're thinking about conducting qualitative inquiry. Next slide, please. So before we think about going out into the field and meeting with the participants in the communities where we're working, we really want to think about really the broad question of why we're doing this research. So the purpose is typically maybe one statement that describes the type of phenomenon that we're interested in for a specific group of people that we're interested in. It's really why we're doing this research. The objectives, you may have one or multiple objectives come out of the purpose, and we're really trying to understand what the intended outcomes are out of this purpose that we're thinking about. This analysis helps us to identify the patterns and the themes that we're going to be thinking about during the analysis phase. Next slide, please. So once we have a purpose in mind, in other words, why we want to conduct this qualitative inquiry, once we've started thinking about the types of objectives or the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve through this inquiry, we want to start thinking about the research questions that will help drive the study itself. So I think oftentimes we think about the types of questions that we may want to ask the community members where we're working, and those are more interview guide questions or topical outlines, but we really want to take a step back and think first about the overarching research questions that will drive the interview guides that we will develop for the fieldwork. So typically we think of a handful of research questions, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, overarching research questions that will really think big picture, help us think about really the objectives of this study. So you may have sub-questions as part of your research questions, but we really want to keep it concise, and we want to be very deliberate about the research questions that we're thinking about. So some points some features of a good set of research questions are highlighted on the screen. So these are very focused questions. We want to think about what we already know, whether that's from secondary data, ongoing routine monitoring data that you're collecting. We really want to think about what other information is missing, and why we're thinking about qualitative as something that will complement perhaps existing information, or maybe there's a question that has come out from information that you've already started gathering that you want to explore further. On the right-hand side of the screen, you will see some probing starting points for how you may want to develop research questions. So we really want to think open-ended questions. So how does, or why do, or under what conditions does X, Y, Z? Next slide, please. So again, thinking about data recording, data management, and data and quality assurance, as well as our analysis plan, we'll just take a quick second to think about the sampling frame and the types of data sources that we'll be looking at before we really dive into those topics. Next slide, please. So in terms of the sampling strategy, I think most people are quite familiar with quantitative methodology and the types of sampling strategies that you can develop as part of your activities. For qualitative sampling, we really want to be very strategic about who we want to meet with and why. And so some core questions that you may ask yourself are around the type of variability that you will encounter in the communities that you're working in. So we want to think about very clear set of criteria that you will be using to select the communities that you'll visit, but also the types of people, the groups of people, the categories of people that you'll meet with. And so we want to think about like very clearly defined categories of people that will have a perspective that will bring insight to this qualitative study. But again, the idea is that you have to be very strategic because there may be limited resources, limited time, the team may be quite small. So generally we think of purposive sampling strategy. So we want to think very clearly about the people that will have a perspective that is very specific to their position, their office, their expertise, and we really want to dive into topics that they're familiar with. It may be participants of the activities that you're working in that have received training or have received support from your activities. It may be community members who haven't received support. And so you may want to you will need to think very clearly about why you're choosing to meet with certain groups of people when you're in the community. In terms of the data sources that we want to pull from, we really want to think about where and from whom the study team will target its data collection. And so you want to think again about your secondary data, which is going to highlight what you know, but also gaps in the information that you have. You want to think about activity staff. So whether that's perhaps somebody in a specific sector, so maybe your WASH colleagues, it may be people in a local government office, traditional authority figures. You may have people from a partner institution in a consortium, for instance, that will have information that's very relevant to, again, your research questions. In terms of the data collection tools, we can think about direct observation, which is a very structured way of thinking about what we're observing in the communities we're visiting. We may also consider interactive tools, and this may be a seasonal calendar that you create that will highlight, for instance, agricultural seasonal practices, rainfall patterns, when harvest takes place, planting takes place, and then that will give us information that's very interesting, very specific. You may think of community maps, where you design the map of the community you're in with the stakeholders that you're meeting with. And so that's a very interactive process where you're sitting with a group of people in a highly interactive way where they are designing on a map, on a piece of paper, where the river runs. Perhaps a bridge broke over the course of the last few months because of flooding, and so they're letting you know through this process what their community looks like, any changes that may be taking place, things like that. And so we have direct observation, interactive tools, and we also have interview tools. For the purpose of this specific event, we'll be looking at topical outlines, which we usually generate for focus group discussions and for key informant interviews. Next slide, please. Now we'll dive into data entry, management, and quality assurance. Next slide, please. In terms of data entry, you really want to think first about the process you will implement in the community, meaning, you'll need your material in place, your notebook, your pens, pencils, all your material in place. You want to think about the dynamic between you as a data collector and the people that you're meeting with. Here we're kind of skipping ahead a little bit along the timeline, but I just want to make a quick note so we're not losing track of the interaction, the dynamic between us as data collectors, activity members perhaps, and the communities that we're working with, that we're partnering with. But in terms of data entry, if we're moving ahead along this process, we want to think about the time it takes and the energy it takes for us as monitoring staff to sit with our teams and to sit with the information that we've just gathered in the interviews, and the time and the effort it takes to be very careful about how we record this information into our notes. And so one thing that I think we often don't realize is how much time it does take to really make sure that we've captured all that great, rich information in a very clearly organized, strategic way. So we suggest a day for data entry for each day of data collection. And so that may mean that if you or your team members are in a community gathering information, meeting with, again, maybe a religious leader and a market actor, and you have two different focus groups, that's four interviews in one day, then you should think about having a day in between the next round of data collection to be able to sit with your team, to be able to make sure that those notes are clearly typed up in your computer and they're organized and saved for your analysis. You may want to consider using a recording device as a backup, but we really don't want to think about having a recorder, whether it's on our phone or a separate recorder, as the main source of data capture. One, because technical issues may come up, but also we really want to think of ourselves as part of the process in qualitative data collection. And so that, again, that dynamic is very important between us and the people that we're meeting with. And so the audio recorder may be useful in some cases, but you really want to think, again, about issues on confidentiality. We're not going to have time, unfortunately, to dive into obtaining informed consent, but we're just glossing over a lot of very important topics, unfortunately. But in the toolkit, you'll have more information about these very important topics. The point of data entry is that you really should have a very clear system where you have very clearly defined names for each of your files. You have a way to track all these interview notes. You have backup options in case, for whatever reason, perhaps you lose your notebook, perhaps your computer crashes. You have some sort of storage solution already in place much before you're actually in the community collecting information. Next slide, please. Again, I think we have to, some of this is the same information that we just discussed already, but you should just establish a file naming system with your team, and that may be based on the community, it may be based on the type of informant that you're meeting with. You do want to think very clearly about the type of bias that you may be introducing unintentionally into these dynamics. And so we always recognize ourselves as part of the dynamic in qualitative inquiry. And so once we're talking about data analysis, this is something that uh, we don't want to leave until the last minute. Um, uh, and again, in the training, again, we're glossing over a very important part of this information, but the training that you establish with your team, whether that's the meal team, maybe you have consultants, is a key part of all of these processes that you establish. Next slide, please. One of the things that we would like to propose as an option is to have a daily debrief template. So if you're thinking about collecting data perhaps on Tuesday, where you meet with your participants and stakeholders, perhaps at the end of that day, you have an opportunity to sit with your colleagues who are also collecting data or who are part of the meal team perhaps, and you want to think about two things. One, any logistical issues that may need to be discussed. So for instance, maybe the group of agricultural specialists who you were going to meet with had a late day in the field, and so they weren't able to meet with you. And so you want to think logistically what you can do the next day to address that issue. You also want to think about the themes that are coming up day by day so that you have a chance with your team to think about how to ask questions perhaps differently once you're in the field on Thursday or Wednesday. So we have this template laid out in the toolkit, and you can look at it in much more detail. But again, we want to think about these conversations that are happening with your team members on how specific topics may be coming up. Perhaps you have certain gaps that you may want to address in the subsequent round of interviews. Next slide, please. I won't go into detail about on these steps that we've proposed in the qualitative design toolkit, but essentially we want to think about again the system that you and your team members have in place for how you enter the data, how do you manage the data, any quality assurance issues that are going to come up that need to be discussed very early on. But we do have some ideas about how this can work, and we welcome you to take a closer look at this in the toolkit. Next slide, please. We have a handful of issues on the slide in front of you in terms of what may come up as a risk for data quality and credibility. And so again, you might want to think, you will need to think very clearly about all these potential risks and how you would address them much before they even come up. In order to have a qualitative inquiry that's very robust and rigorous, and that where you can use your findings in a way that you're confident about them. Next slide, please. Again, we've discussed this already, but your team will need to have a system in place that you're going to discuss through the training, whether that you have consultants, you have multiple meal staff. You should consider having a pilot or a pre-test before you even conduct any qualitative data collection. And you should definitely consider having regular check-ins with your team through the debrief that we just discussed, but also through different check-in points throughout your data collection phase. Again, I cannot do justice to the importance of having very deliberate safeguards and ethical considerations taken into place. We have very specific guidelines that we're proposing in the toolkit, and we welcome you to take a look at those very carefully. But typically, in many cases, we are tasked with meeting with the institutional review board and having a very clear protocol for how we're going to obtain consent in an informed way. And how we're going to store data, any confidentiality issues that are very important to think about very clearly and outline with that group of stakeholders. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now we're going to go over a couple of terms in terms of data analysis and data interpretation. We propose a handful of steps on the screen in front of you. We really want to think about data analysis as first of all, how we organize our data, and then how we bring meaning to it. What themes are coming out of it? What's the significance of this information? And so we can say that step one is really having a system where you have a very clearly laid out way of categorizing your information after you've read it and reread it and reread it perhaps again, and where you may be applying codes or applying certain techniques to help you understand and be very familiar with the information that you've collected. Step 2 is really identifying the patterns and the relationships that are coming out in your data. And step 3, we summarize the data. Next slide, please. I don't think we'll have much time to go into the different types of qualitative analysis, but the more common type we would say is thematic analysis. So again, this is bringing out the types of themes and patterns that are coming out from the data. So you may want to think about perhaps certain drivers that are coming out, certain outcomes from certain program activities that you have in place. Next slide, please. Again, we have a couple extra types of data analysis to discuss. I think we're running close to time, so we may just skip ahead to the next slide. A couple of things to keep in mind. When we discuss coding, we think about how we group either keywords or phrases into types of buckets, where we have some sort of theme running across our data set. And we'll be doing an exercise in the group work on how to code. So we can talk about different coding options in just a minute. When we talk about saturation, we think about at what point does the data, at what point we've learned enough about the data where any additional information that we're reading is already confirming what we've read or what we've collected. And so this may happen much earlier than we think. So we may not need 50 focus group discussions. We may reach saturation much earlier. And so again, this is why when we talk about the sampling strategy being very strategic, we're saying this because we want to know at what point have we obtained the information that we were that we may be looking for, or that gives us information that we didn't have before. Triangulation refers to a very important process of cross-checking data, perhaps across different types of stakeholders. So you may want to think about your key stakeholders as well as the participants. You also want to think about quantitative and qualitative data and how that either confirms findings, or you may have contradictions, or you may have explanatory information that you really want to think about. And so it's not about one data type being better than another. It's about finding complementarity, finding where the gaps are, and finding how we can use different types of data collection to answer our questions. Next slide, please. I think we're running close to time, but we'll go over 2 types of data management systems. The first is software-assisted, a software-assisted approach, and there are different options that you can purchase online. The second option is the manual matrix approach, which we'll go over in the group. Next slide, please. A couple of, you can go to the next one. Thank you. Thanks, Val. A couple of pros and cons for the software-assisted approach, and that may be in vivo, or maybe Atlas QDA, maybe Atlas TI, Max QDA, excuse me. There are a number of options that your organization may purchase online. I think what we want to just mention is that these types of software are packages that help us manage our data. They don't do the analysis for us. They really help us organize and perhaps rework the interview notes that we have in a different method. And so they may be useful, and they may be very, very practical for you and your team. Perhaps if you have a very large data set, perhaps if you have multiple parent codes. And a code is again either a keyword or a phrase that has some sort of meaning to us that comes out of the data. We also want to think about larger kind of umbrella data sets or parent codes. But again, one of the issues with software assisted approach is that they may be cost prohibitive. The licenses typically are quite pricey. You may have some options for academic licenses, things like that. There is a learning curve, and so you want to think very clearly whether or not these options are valuable to you and your team. There is some time that you will have to dedicate to how to use the platform that you choose. These software platforms provide many times options to create visualizations or data viz, and they may be useful. So that may be a heat map, it may be a type of like a bar graph, and maybe a calendar, but we want to be very careful not to quantify the qualitative information we have. So while we may, be very drawn to some kind of visual ways of representing our data, we just want to be careful that not to assume that output replaces us as qualitative analysts. Next slide, please. Here we have just a quick screenshot of what a coding screen would look like for in vivo. We can just skip over this, I think, for now. In terms of the manual matrix approach, we have just a few more slides and I think I'll wrap up. So the manual matrix approach is typically done through either an Excel spreadsheet or a Google spreadsheet. The reason we often lean on this method is because it's very accessible to access both Excel and Google Sheets. You probably don't even need the internet for Excel. You will when you need to transfer that information to your team member, perhaps. Most of us know how to use Excel very well and very easily. It's low tech. You can typically use Excel at the end of your night once you've already collected your information during the day. So it's something that's quite easy to use, quite convenient. Some of the considerations is that we may have a lot of information, and so it may be a bit clunky to read through our interview notes if we have a very large data set. And so our Excel may be quite large at the end of the data collection, data entry phase. You can't automatically import data, so you have to go in cell by cell and type in your data, copy and paste. I think typically there are no data visualization options, and so that's just something to think about. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Here we have an example of how we can code information. And so what you see in the red text is something that we as a researcher, we thought about, oh, this is an interesting piece of information that we want to highlight for our second round of reading through this data set. And again, the coding process is important because it's helping us in our minds organize the information that we've collected. But this is, again, one technique that we use as part of our data analysis. Next slide, please. We can also try to think about how we use drop-down menus and filters and sorting options in Excel or in Google spreadsheets. And again, these are techniques that help us organize the information that we've already collected in a way that makes sense to us as we're reading through our data set and rereading again. Next slide, please. In terms of the manual matrix, I think I might have skipped a slide, I apologize, but we want to think about reading our data set vertically and horizontally. And so again, that means thinking about our interviews themselves. So we may have one interview with focus group participants, but we also have the same types of information being collected from different types of stakeholders. So we think about our matrix vertically and horizontally, and we'll go more in depth on that process in our group work. Just a couple final thoughts in terms of how we think about qualitative inquiry. You may consider having a validation workshop near the end of your data collection process where you once you've already gathered your information, you've entered it into your data management system, you've sat together perhaps with your team members, and you've started thinking about the different patterns that are coming out, the relationships that are coming out, what's driving certain behavior, certain relationships. And so does the data make sense based on what research questions we've developed early on in the inquiry? Do we have buy-in from the stakeholders that are a part of this study, part of our activity? what are the gaps that we still have? You may want to consider having additional interviews after the validation workshop, perhaps with other staff in your organization, for instance. Are there any recommendations that are not feasible? Once you've gathered the information, perhaps community members are asking for a new bridge to be built, and this keeps coming up in your data, but maybe the resources, the time, the constraints are beyond the control of the activity that you're in. And so this validation workshop is really another space, another opportunity for you as MEAL team members, as programming staff, to sit together, perhaps with members of another sector in the activity. So perhaps you have WASH staff and livelihood staff and protection staff sitting together and thinking through the findings and seeing, does this information make sense? Again, we want to think again about the purpose, the objectives, and the research questions before, during, and after each of these phases. So we really don't want to jump straight into data collection and data analysis and maybe the flashy parts of qualitative inquiry. We want to think about being very purposive and very strategic and why qualitative data is bringing something to the table that's very specific. So again, qualitative inquiry, we're asking typically why and how questions that will complement our existing information or will fill out information that we don't know. We may explore certain topics more. Whether you choose to use software-assisted approach, so those are the software options that I mentioned, like in vivo or MaxQDA, or you go the manual matrix approach, we really want to remember that we are conducting analysis. And so we want to think about our own position within our own office, whether that's, a MEAL officer, a programming staff. We want to think about our dynamic, our subjectivity, and the way we view the world and how we're interpreting the data, because we may interpret data very differently depending on where we're sitting. But at the end of the day, we are conducting the analysis through this very deliberate system that we've set in place. And I'm going to pull this quote from my colleague Karen Fox, who's at this call now. At every step, we're making very thoughtful, deliberate, and transparent choices. And again, the QUIPs, the Qualitative Design Toolkit are tools at our disposal that help us think about these systems that we've established in a very clear and concise way. We really want to think very clearly about why qualitative inquiry is important and what it's bringing to our activity that we definitely need to explore. So I think that's all I have on my end. I will pass it over to Robin or Bella.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ellie, for that brief overview. Unfortunately, I think we went over a little bit of time, so we're not going to have time for questions, the Q&A portion. And we'll have to go right into breakout groups. So now we're going to take about 30 minutes and we are going to go into our small groups. We're going to work together doing just a coding exercise. So each group will be assigned a subset of data from a qualitative matrix where we're going to be doing our own analysis. Because of time constraints, this is a very streamlined and simplified example. So, the matrix has 3 topics on the topical discussion, on the topical outline. We have shocks and stresses, livelihoods, and health. So each group will be assigned one of those 3 themes, and you will focus on analyzing the data that's in that particular category. You don't have to go through the entire matrix. So each team will need to assign somebody in their group to take notes. We're going to give you a matrix, a link to a matrix where you can open it up and take notes. And qualitative data are very critical to contextualize and explain and interpret our quantitative findings in order to provide key insights into less quantifiable aspects of activities interventions. So that is definitely something we need to keep in mind as we're working through our data. You will be randomly assigned into a breakout room, and you will get a message that will pop up letting you know which group that you are going to join. Once you get into your group, you're going to do 3 steps. So number 1, you're going to read the research questions that we're going to give you. Number two, you need to go through, well, you're going to read the research questions. You're going to read the interview matrix. Try to give yourself 5 or 10 minutes just to read through the matrix. And you're going to get a sense of kind of what the data looks like, and you start looking for keywords and phrases. Number two, step two is you're going to start to work in your groups to identify the themes and the patterns and relationships in the data. You start organizing your data into very broad themes and categories, and you're going to develop sort of a coding framework. So the most common type of coding is generally color coding. So you can use colored fonts to highlight key topics. So for example, if you're talking about shocks and stresses, you might use red font for information on inflation or increased market prices, green font for crops and pests or insect pests, purple for health issues, blue for floods, orange for drought, that sort of thing. So you're going to make up some sort of coding system within your group, and then you're going to start coding the data using that system that you all come up with. And you're going to read through your data kind of line by line and try to code as much as you can. And then you just continue to discuss within your group if there are any sub-themes that you should combine together, or if you need to merge some themes. And then finally, in the last maybe 5-10 minutes, your group needs to try to summarize the main points of the text. There you'll see in this spreadsheet, there's a column on the far right where you can kind of summarize the data. And you can use quotations from participants to highlight any findings that you have. So your groups are going to take notes in the documents. And you'll see 3 columns on the right-hand side. There's column H, column I, and column J, where you're going to take your notes and you're going to add in your coding themes and also your synthesis, how you synthesize the data. Okay, so we have about 30 minutes in our groups, and then we will come back into the plenary session and we'll do a very short report out. Well, unfortunately, we had a very short amount of time that, normally you'd spend a lot more time, going through your analysis, but this is, just a very short event. So we don't have enough time to go through everything the way we would normally do it. But I just kind of want to see how groups felt, what challenges did you all as a group, did you have with identifying themes? What was difficult, or what were the main challenges in your group as far as identifying themes? And I'll just kind of throw that broadly to the audience and see if anybody wants to respond. Hi, Joshua, go ahead.
Sure, thank you. I think it felt like flying blind until we sort of had the research questions. So that was really helpful to like a reminder about the research questions. So it sort of helps to guide the approach to read the text. So research questions very helpful.
Okay, good. So reading the interview questions were helpful guide is what I got. Anybody else want to mention any challenges you had as far as identifying themes, grouping themes, whether or not they, which ones should be grouped together, which ones should be disaggregated?
Yeah, hi, Robin. This is Frank. What we found, and we just looked at one question, was that there was such a variety of topics in each of the different focus groups that we looked at. We really recognized the need to be able to kind of reconcile and the different, even the thematic words, when we try to synthesize, that people use different terminology, people use, and there's so many different themes in each one, that there's really a need to reconcile those before you can even do an analysis. And especially, I think that would be especially important with a large number of responses.
Yeah. Ellie, I see that's definitely a problem. Oftentimes there are multiple themes and within themes. So that is a question. How far do you disaggregate your data? But it all kind of comes back to the research question. What are you asking? What are you looking for in the data? Ellie, I see you've got some questions from your group.
No, that was a question, Robin. Thanks. Yeah, that was really how do we develop these codes and what I think thinking through what makes sense, like how big should the code be? How specific do we want to be? I think it's these are interesting questions, and I think the answers vary by your team and the way you process and organize data in your mind. So yeah, was happy to pass on that question from our group.
Is this something that is normally kind of addressed when you are testing the questions and doing the kind of pre-assessment work? How do you normally address this in the field, Ellie?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have a very good answer. So your question, how do we determine the codes beforehand? Is that right?
Yeah, or do you? Yeah.
I don't know if I can volunteer Karen to jump in, but paraphrase.
Inevitably. It's a great question. And there's so many resources available to us on qualitative analysis. And I tend to fall into the school, and I think you'll see in reading about other analysis approaches that others do as well, that there's the inductive and deductive. In one case we're imposing codes upon the data set. In other cases we're allowing those codes to emerge. And I think we have research questions, we have a sampling frame, we have designed tools that are focused on specific topics of interest and relevance to the problems we are trying to solve. So naturally, some codes fall out of those. But what's so important is to read that data set and know it intimately as you're doing that analysis, and preferably with a team of people who are sitting together and sort of challenging each other on, nope, that's not what that says, so that we can collectively identify new codes or themes of interest. And I think your point about language is so important. We see this all the time, particularly when codes are kind of imposed and used without that intimate reading of data. We miss so much because we have different and unexpected ways. We explain things in very unique and unpredictable ways. And often it requires not just triangulation within the analysis team, but also going back to our program staff, to if we're hiring a data collection firm, to people who are real experts in the context, to verify and constantly questioning. It's a very active, engaged process from beginning to end. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think in our group, for example, Vilma, I'll volunteer you. Talked about the value of using in vivo, for the coding component where you identify keywords or themes that are of interest, but it picks up an entire paragraph. So you're getting, a particular code of interest in context. But, can't emphasize enough how important it is, even if you're using in vivo or Atlas TI, whatever it may be, to really read through that data set so that you're not missing those words that may be lost in translation. And by translation, I mean sort of the human, the marvelous, disaggregated and differentiated way that we describe the human experience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen. I also just want to mention I'll just throw this out there. One thing that we often do as a team, and I often work with Charles a lot for this sort of thing, was we'll do sort of a validation exercise. So if you have multiple team members, multiple analysts who are looking at particular data, you can have a validation exercise so that you go through a subset of data and you see how are you coding things, how is Charles coding things versus how I'm coding things, and you kind of look through that and come together and come to a consensus on how you're going to do the coding. I see Charles has his hand up, so go ahead, Charles.
Thank you. We had a great question from Karen in our group about how we arrived at the data information in the data matrix. That there is a process that's taken place where the interview took place. They asked the focus group participants the questions, and then they summarized the responses into this matrix. And so there's a question that I wanted us to talk about briefly about how do you go from that process of conducting an interview to then summarizing it in the matrix. And my initial response was that during these kind of ground truthing sessions with data collection or with the researchers, there's an opportunity there to talk with them and assign those main buckets, main group responses, and really try and suss out whether it's an opinion from one person or from multiple. So kind of over to you, Robin and Ellie, talking about going from that interview process to the more summarized format that we're looking at now. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah, you are looking across the data. You're looking at your key informant interviews and your focus group discussions on each particular topic that you are interested in looking at, and then having to, yeah, take all that information and try to boil it down into, you know, a very short paragraph or a few sentences. Yeah, it's a very tricky process, I would say. Okay, well, I think we're about at time. Unfortunately, I think we have to wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for such a great conversation. And thank you so much to our presenter, Ellie. We greatly appreciate you just sort of taking your time today to share your knowledge with this community. It's really great to have these exchanges of good practice. Thanks again to Frank and Charles, Karen, Hannah, Paul, Niall for just helping to facilitate those breakout room discussions. Thank you, Bella, for your technical lead today. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap up. I do have some announcements before everybody sort of drops off here. So as a final request, we'd like you to please follow the link that Bella's going to post in the chat to do an evaluation survey of today's event. This kind of helps us enhance future events and make them better. And if you think you're interested in kind of joining the QualME peer community listserv that we have, there's an opportunity to indicate your interest in that evaluation form. We will send out a follow-up email in the next few days after this event with all the materials from today's session. So you'll get the recording and the slide deck and everything if you would like to go back and look at some of that individually. We have some announcements about IDEAL has just released the version 2.0 of the Qualitative Design Toolkit. We have upgraded the toolkit, and Bella can put that link into our chat. This updated version includes new sections and additional tools to further support your qualitative design studies. And you can find it online on the FSN Network website. Also, I just want to, just a reminder that IDEAL has some new e-courses that are going to be coming out very soon. The first one is going to be based on that qualitative design toolkit that we have. This e-course is a step-by-step guidance for qualitative monitoring and evaluation. It's based on the toolkit, and it will go into more in-depth training on, you know, basically everything that's in the toolkit. It's in the beta testing phase right now, where it's almost finalized. It should be out by the end of this month, pretty soon. And then secondly, we will have a second e-course that Ellie is developing for us on the qualitative data recording, data management, and analysis piece that we talked about here today. So this topic will cover those sort of, that e-course will cover this sort of topics that we talked about here. That we're going to post, if you're interested in doing a beta test, if you'd like to help us beta test that course that's going to be coming out soon, there's a Google form that I think Bella put into the chat. We're looking for a few practitioners to help beta test and this data analysis e-course. So feel free to sign up for that. And then also just keep a lookout in the FSN newsletter. We'll always post our events. Our QualME events will be posted in that newsletter. And we'll send out, further emails when events come out and when the e-courses are released for public. So thank you all today. Have a good day and bye.